My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year-end celebration of our participation as a university in the President's Interfaith and Community Service Campus Challenge. Now, as just about everyone in this room knows, and we've got our whole community represented here, student leaders, members of our campus ministry, as well as supporters of this initiative in government, NGOs, and the education sector. Those of you who know Georgetown know that interfaith dialogue and community service are really deeply held values close to our institutional identity. And over the past year, across the country, several hundred institutions, colleges, and universities have taken up that same challenge with us of combining interfaith dialogue and community service. It's been an opportunity for us here at Georgetown to live out those values in new ways. We've got some flyers in the back to give you a sense of the range of engagement. And President DeGioia, who will introduce our speaker, Eboo Patel, will give you a little overview of some of the high points of our work this past year. We're honored to have Eboo with us, head of the Interfaith Youth Core, a real innovator in this area, and who was there at the beginning of this initiative in his service on the President's Advisory Council on Neighborhood and Faith-Based Partnerships. So he'll give us a big overview of his view of the development of this initiative and why it's important. We'll also hear from a couple of students here at Georgetown, and then share some reflections or hear some reflections from Father Kevin O'Brien, our Vice President for Mission and Ministry, whose office has been at the heart of our efforts here at Georgetown. I hope we'll have a little time after the formal presentations for some informal discussion, and you will have seen the tables outside, some time for a reception in the beautiful, sunny Dahlgren Quad. It's now my pleasure to introduce President DeGioia. As you know, Dr. John J. DeGioia has served as the 48th president of Georgetown now since 2001, and before that served for more than 2 decades in a range of other leadership positions at the university. Over the past decade under President DeGioia, Georgetown has emerged as a global force in higher education and as an innovator in efforts to link up our core mission of teaching and research with service to the wider world. Examples include our campus in Doha, Qatar, our outreach to China, and our partnership with the Archbishop of Canterbury's Muslim-Christian Dialogue, Building Bridges. Dr. DeGioia addresses broader issues in higher education as a chair of the Board of Directors of Campus Compact and of the Forum for the Future of Higher Education. He also serves as a member of the Board of Directors for the National Association of Independent Colleges. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming President Jack DeGioia.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here today as we celebrate Georgetown's contributions to President Obama's Interfaith and Community Service Challenge. And I'd especially like to thank Tom and Melody Fox Ahmed at our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, as well as Father Kevin O'Brien and Lisa Panucci in Campus Ministry for their leadership of this critical campus-wide initiative. I'd also like to welcome 3 very special guests: Ken Bedell, a senior advisor in the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships; Michael Galligan-Sturl, president of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities; and Dr. Lynn Kunkel, a trustee of the El Hebri Charitable Foundation. And I'm also deeply grateful to our distinguished guest, Eboo Patel, for joining us this afternoon, and I'll have an opportunity to introduce Eboo at greater length in just a few minutes. As a Catholic and Jesuit university, the pursuit of interfaith understanding is deeply rooted in Georgetown's tradition. Our founder, John Carroll, made a commitment to this work at the founding of our university when he wrote in the original papers for Georgetown that we should be open to students of every religious profession. And this year, President Obama's challenge has given us the opportunity to renew and strengthen our commitment to this central aspect of our mission and identity. Specifically, it has enabled us to expand the reach and impact of our interfaith connections, both by helping us to link these discussions more explicitly with community service and by pressing us to develop new platforms for interfaith dialogue and intercultural engagement. Our work throughout the challenge has focused on two primary service components: creating more equitable educational opportunities and reducing poverty in the United States. Within that context, here are just a few examples of the activities we've pursued over the course of the year. We've hosted 6 roundtable discussions open to students, faculty, and staff on topics like our 25 Days of Service initiative, Thanksgiving, and the power of volunteering. We've organized 2 major service projects, one for our first-year students in September and one for the entire university community in conjunction with our annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration in January. We added an interfaith component to our, we're renovating the chapel. And I don't mind the distraction. It's just sometimes I get a little nervous about it. We're trying to do all this without ever having to cancel a wedding. And to some of you, that may not mean anything, but on Saturdays, as we run through wedding after wedding, you get an appreciation as to why we're trying to do both at the same time. So there's nothing to worry about. We added an interfaith component to our alternate spring break program, in which over 275 students participated, by holding a post-trip dialogue on the role of faith in our students' experience. And we also held a number of specific interfaith events, such as our 9/11 memorial, our Thanksgiving prayer services, and our open houses for diverse religious services across campus, and then our Faith in Conversation series. And just as we began the year, we will end our work this year with major symposia, such as the gathering we're enjoying today. Throughout these efforts, we've seen deeper engagement across our campus community with ideas of open and honest dialogue across faith, appreciation and understanding of difference and the value of service, and yet uniting those with diverse beliefs and experiences in support of the betterment of those we serve. These outcomes have allowed us to bring together and live out 2 of our most important values: being women and men for others, and building a community in diversity. And I wish to thank each of you here today for engaging in this critical work and for helping us to continue our efforts to fulfill the vision of our founder by striving to become the university we are meant to be. Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, and that's Eboo Patel, a widely recognized and respected leader on issues of interfaith dialogue and cooperation. Eboo has been pursuing these ideas throughout his life and has formalized his commitment through the creation of the Interfaith Youth Core, which he incorporated as a one-person office in 2002. Today, he serves as president of the Interfaith Youth Core, which works with students and faculty on 140 college and university campuses nationwide. The breadth of the organization's impact is indicative of the effort and passion that he has invested into the goal of making interfaith cooperation a social norm for our current generation of young people. Beyond his work with the Interfaith Youth Core, he contributes regularly to numerous publications, including the Washington Post, USA Today, the Huffington Post, and he has spoken at the TED Conference, the Clinton Global Initiative, and the Nobel Peace Prize Forum. He's the author of Acts of Faith and co-editor of Building the Interfaith Youth Movement. He's been named by Islamica magazine as one of the young Muslims shaping the future of Islam in America, and by the Harvard Kennedy School Review as one of the 5 future policy leaders to watch. He was appointed, as Tom mentioned, by President Obama to serve on the first ever advisory council for the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and he also serves on the Religious Advisory Committee of the Council on Foreign Relations. Eboo, it's an honor to have you with us today, and it's my pleasure now to introduce you to the Georgetown University community.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much. So I've had friends here at Georgetown for many years. Professor Banchoff, Melody Fox Ahmed, Imam Yahya Hendi, and my friend and mentor Jim Wallace, who teaches here, speak to me glowingly about the work that goes on at Georgetown, especially the interfaith work. And they tell me that somebody who has cared about that throughout his career here has been President DeGioia. And I come to DC about once a month, and I thought to myself, I would meet President DeGioia on one of those trips to DC. Turned out I had to go halfway around the world to chase him down, and I chased him down in the village streets of Davos, Switzerland, 18 months or so ago, and I told him how impressed I was by the work happening at Georgetown, that this was a university that understood its Catholic identity as a bridge of cooperation, and it was explicit about that. And President DeGioia told me about the founder, John Carroll, and the papers and the charter, and he said, but we're going to keep on doing more. And then I meet Amr Hussein. And Amr Hussein is one of these guys who says, no matter how glowing Georgetown's history is in interfaith cooperation, no matter how impressive, I'm going to be a part of this university doing more. And every time I come back here, there's more. There's another research study. There are more student researchers at the Berkley Center. There's another course on the books. And it's inspiring to come to a campus that is continuing to model what interfaith cooperation can and should look like. One of our dreams at the Interfaith Youth Core is that a college president can shake the hand of any graduate of their university and have a reasonable degree of confidence that that graduate has, over the course of their 4 years at a university, developed appreciative knowledge of other religious traditions, developed positive, meaningful relationships with people of other faiths. And it could well be that Georgetown University is the first university in America to make that a social norm. And so I'm very proud to be here, not to mention that my parents were Catholic educated since they were 5 years old, and I'm continuing that tradition with my own children. And again, it's an understanding of a faith that is deeply rooted in its own tradition, and precisely because it views God as one that's ecumenical and universal, reaches out and is inclusive of people of other faiths. So thank you for that. So one of the most inspiring days of my life was January 20th, 2009. It's a bit on the cold side. I was packed in the subway with 2 million of my favorite citizens, spilled out into the National Mall, and I saw the first black president of America on a video feed walk through the halls of the Capitol, come out onto the steps, take his oath of office and the Bible from the Chief Justice, approach the podium, stare out at 2 million citizens, Lincoln Memorial in the background, and talk about diversity in America. And he used this language. We believe that our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, of Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. And because we have been through those dark chapters of civil war and segregation and emerged stronger and more united than ever before, we believe that a shrinking planet reveals our common humanity, and America will play its role as a force for peace in the world once again. And I thought to myself, how vanguard, how creative that the first black president in the United States, when he talked about America's diversity, would call out a dimension of that diversity that we don't think of as often: religious diversity. Harvard scholar Diana Eck says that America went from a largely Christian country to probably the most religiously diverse nation in human history. Most certainly the most religiously devout nation in the Western Hemisphere at a time of global religious conflict. And what President Obama was saying in that address is the way we relate to each other, we people of many faiths in this nation, the bridges that we build can offer a model for the rest of the world. I think of this as the 21st century city on a hill. When John Winthrop used that language in the Arabella in the 17th century, he viewed it with a steeple in the center. But now that steeple is surrounded by a gurdwara, a temple, a mosque, a sangha, a synagogue, a secular humanist society. And one of the great questions of the 21st century is how those communities are going to relate to each other. What was even more inspiring was recognizing that President Obama stood in a tradition of American presidents and leaders who thought deeply about America's religious diversity. Yes, we've become the most religiously diverse nation on the planet, but we've had different religious communities here for a good long time. And many of our heroes in this country have proactively and positively engaged that reality. When George Washington received a letter from the leader of the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, the first years of his presidency, and he read the language of Moses Sessions, who was frankly scared. What was going to happen to Jews in the new nation? He knew all too well what had happened to them in centuries in Europe, being hounded and hated. And he asked George Washington, will we be safe here? And Washington sends back a letter using this language. This country will give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham sit in safety under their own vine and fig, and let there be none to make him afraid. And he closes that letter, which I think is one of the great documents in the history of our nation, belongs with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, letter from Birmingham jail. He closes that letter with this line: may the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness, and make us useful in our many vocations, and bring us in his own way to everlasting happiness. In my view, that letter, that voicing of a value of interfaith cooperation, sets a tone for the kind of nation that we want to be. Washington is saying, I affirm your identity as a Jewish community. I will protect you. We will seek a positive relationship, and we will commit ourselves to the common good of this new nation. And Washington is just the beginning in a long tradition. When my friend Keith Ellison became the first Muslim to be elected to the United States Congress, and there was some concern over the book that he would take his oath of office on, and some folks said that the Quran, the holy text of his faith, of our faith, was an inappropriate book. One congressperson even said that if Keith Ellison got to take his oath of office on that book, then Muslims from all over the world would rush the steps of the Capitol demanding Qurans. That's not a joke, by the way. That happened. Keith Ellison walked to the Library of Congress and approached the rare books librarian and requested the Quran, once owned by Thomas Jefferson, and took his oath of office on the Quran that Jefferson reverently owned. There's an inspiring story about Georgetown's history, which is that when President Clinton decided he wanted to do an iftar at the White House in the 1990s, he tapped one of Georgetown's staff members and faculty members, Imam Yahya Hendi, to help him plan it and to lead prayers. But Clinton wasn't the first president to host an iftar at the White House. That belongs to Thomas Jefferson. From early days in this nation, we were a nation that had different religious communities: Quakers and Congregationalists, Catholics and Baptists. And the heroes of this country said to themselves and their fellow citizens, we are going to be a nation that welcomes the contributions of all communities and fosters positive relations between them. If I had to pick, for me, the single most inspiring story in this American trajectory, it would probably be during late winter 1950, when a young man, prince of the black church, grew up almost entirely around other black Baptists in Atlanta, educated at Morehouse, finds himself in the North at seminary, decides that he wants to go see a great African-American scholar, president of Howard University, Mordecai Johnson, preach on the topic of Christian love. He takes a train to Fellowship House in Philadelphia, and he sits in that lecture hall, and he listens to President Mordecai Johnson use as the example of Christian love a Hindu from India, Mahatma Gandhi. And I sometimes wonder to myself, the various things that must have been going through young Martin Luther King Jr.'s mind in that moment. Perhaps that this was an alien concept to him, maybe an offensive concept, that somebody from another religion could be a positive embodiment, in fact, a superior embodiment of an ethic that he thought belonged only in his own. What King ends up doing is asking himself the question, if Gandhi found in Hinduism the resources and inspiration to commit deeply to a movement of nonviolent social reform, if he wrote that the Sermon on the Mount and the writings of Tolstoy were inspirations along the way in his Hindu journey, perhaps I ought to go back to my scripture. Perhaps I ought to go back to my theology and see if I can deepen my own ethic of social justice and social reform. So I have this image of King in the library of Crozier. On his left-hand side are books by Walter Rauschenbusch and Reinhold Niebuhr and the Bible. And on his right-hand side is the growing literature on Gandhi. And he's going back and forth between them, seeking to learn from this other tradition and looking to deepen into his own. And a few years later, when he gets his first call to the pulpit, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on that fateful bus, and E.D. Nixon and Ralph Abernathy and the other senior African-American leaders of Montgomery are looking for a leader who can convene them, they choose King. And King goes to Jesus, and King goes to Gandhi. And he creates a bus boycott that he patterns in large part after Gandhi's Salt March. And after 380 some days of walking to work, losing jobs, suffering death threats and fire bombings, they get to sit where they want on the buses in one provincial city in the American South. And a journalist, around the time the boycott is ending and the buses are desegregated, says to King, Reverend King, such a small victory at such a large sacrifice. Aren't you angry? Don't you seek revenge when you think of all that you've sacrificed? And King, I imagine, again thinking of Jesus and thinking of Gandhi, says, this isn't the time for revenge. This is the time for redemption. This is the time for reconciliation. This is the time to build the beloved community. King is so moved by the work of Gandhi that he takes a trip to India in 1959. Gandhi has been dead for 12 years, meets the same fate that King would meet a decade later, assassination. But King wants to see the legacy of that movement. And what moves King when he goes to India is that the movement that Gandhi started out of the inspiration of his Hindu faith is not a Hindu movement. It has Jains, it has Buddhists, it has Christians, it has Muslims, it has humanists, it has Hindus. It's an interfaith movement. And King's beloved community in his mind starts to widen. He comes back to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and he preaches on Palm Sunday a sermon about Gandhi. He ends it with two things. The first is this line: "O God, our gracious Heavenly Father, we call you this name. We know some call you Brahma. We know some call you Allah. We know some call you Elohim. We know some call you the unmoved mover." And the final thing that King does is issue an altar call. Come to Jesus. And I love that. I love those two twin things. That King is strong in his faith, deep in his faith. He says, many people want to make of me many things, but at bottom, I'm a Baptist minister, and I'm the son of a Baptist minister. And my commitment to Jesus as the Son of the living God is higher than any other commitment that I have. And King views other traditions as things to learn from, to appreciate, to partner with, to deepen his own faith. I think that's the best of interfaith cooperation. That's what I see when I talk to Shivam, the other students here, is their leadership in creating interfaith events helps them reflect on and strengthen their own traditions in precisely the same way King learned from Gandhi, marched with Heschel, nominated Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, for a Nobel Peace Prize, and all throughout was reflecting, how can I be a better Christian? One of the things that I think escapes us often about King is how young he was when he was going through this process. Frankly, and now I'm looking at you all, sophomores and juniors, your age. 20 years old when he went to see Mordecai Johnson. 20 years old when he was going back and forth between Niebuhr and biographies of Gandhi. The same thing that was happening to Martin Luther King Jr. when he was a student, it's what's happening to you. The events that he was leading, the thoughts that he was thinking, the writings that he was beginning to put to paper, that's precisely what you're doing, building the beloved community at Gordon College, at George Washington, at Georgetown, at Syracuse. In that Oval Office meeting that President Obama had with his inaugural Faith Council, I expected him to talk about the importance of faith communities engaged in service work. I expected him to talk a little bit about religious diversity and interfaith cooperation. After all, it had been one of the themes of his inauguration. What I didn't expect is him to say, and young people ought to be in leadership. And Jim Wallace, who was standing next to me, elbows me in the ribs and says, he's talking about the movement you're involved in. And he was. And he proved it. The President's Interfaith Service and Campus Community Challenge. That came from the President's desk, nurtured by the White House Faith Office, nurtured by people like Ken Bedell of the Department of Education. But that came from the President's desk. This is something he cares about personally. And I started to wonder why. Why was this so personal for Obama? If you go back to Dreams from My Father and read the section on Chicago, the time when he was a community organizer in South Chicago, and you read it carefully, what you'll realize is that the communities that Obama was organizing, Muslim groups, Catholic parishes, Protestant churches, all under the leadership, the mentorship of a Jewish organizer, Obama was an interfaith leader. Obama was up close and personal with the social capital and civic engagement and cosmic moral arc that religious communities hold. Obama was realizing the importance and the power of bridging that cosmic social capital. And so when he became president, I think one of the thoughts going through his mind was, what if we set a generation of other young people on that path? What if we encouraged presidents of colleges like President DeGioia to say, we at Georgetown are going to be an ecology of interfaith cooperation, but only if you students are going to lead it. We'll have the resources. We've got the right ingredients. We're one of the most unique places on the planet in terms of lifting up people's particular identities and building bridges between those identities. But it's going to have to be students who lead it. And every time we get a video from Syracuse or Georgetown, and there's Amr talking about another event that he ran, there's Shivam, and we get another dispatch from George Washington University about what they're doing, we think to ourselves, and students are leading it. I want to leave you with an obvious thought and a final quote. Here's the obvious thought. Every generation in American history you could read as a battle between the forces of pluralism and the forces of prejudice. During the Know-Nothing and anti-Catholic era in the late 19th century, the forces of prejudice were arrayed against Catholics. And the forces of pluralism, in the form of Jane Addams and Hull House and other social reformers of that time, stood up against it. During anti-Semitism, you had forces of pluralism in the form of George Washington and others standing up against that and saying, actually, you're getting America wrong. We are a nation that doesn't exclude people based on their faith. We welcome them. We build bridges between them. So the next chapter is not going to write itself. Right? Pens don't fall from the sky. History doesn't just rise from the ground. People write that next chapter. Bridges don't just emerge out of thin air. People build bridges between communities of different faiths. If you're not going to do it, who is? If you don't get your friends and colleagues and fellow students at Syracuse and at Gordon and at Georgetown to engage in this, who will? I'll tell you something. The forces of prejudice in our era are no less ugly, no less shy than the forces of prejudice in other eras. Question for us is, are the forces of pluralism going to be as strong? And it's your work, your videos, that give us a ton of hope at Interfaith Youth Core. Give President DeJoya hope. Give Professor Banchoff hope. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to leave you with the final line of the 1893 Parliament of the World's Religions, what I think is one of the great forces of pluralism in that era of anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish sentiment. This is the goal of our movement, that from now on, the great religions of the world make war not on each other, and instead on the giant ills that afflict humankind. Thank you.